Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to truly serve people and earn authentic influence will always produce results that barking orders never will. And if you'll stick with us through the end of the episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's get to work. This episode takes us down the path, and we kind of close the loop now on how breaking the golden rule might actually help us capture some of those costs of poor communication. Once we've come to terms with just how high the cost of poor communication can really be for our organization, and how any poor communication skills existing in organizations just add fuel to those other fires that are killing our profitability, we've got plenty of reasons to address the lack of communication between our managers and our employees. But let's be honest, though, if it were simple as just saying, communicate better, would there be any need to really discuss it here? No, there wouldn't. We would be doing that. We've already worked through many of the effects that it can have in the poor communication can have in the workplace, so I'm not going to continue to hash that out. What I will do, though, is suggest that I'm not sure I've ever met somebody who just wanted to communicate ineffectively with their team, or anybody else for that matter, right? I've never met anybody that wants to communicate with anybody poorly. I believe that all too often it simply boils down to not having the tools, the right tools for the job. And sometimes it's not even understanding that the tools exist. I'm a firm believer in the simpler tools can be, the more effective we can be in whatever we do. Now, most everybody I know is familiar with some better variation of this thing called the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And truth be told, I think our society as a whole would have a whole lot less crap going on if we all did a better job of following that. But while this might solve a ton of other issues that we see in the headlines on any given day, I'm going to suggest right here that breaking the golden rule might be just what we need for addressing that profitability killer that is poor communication. Here's the scenario. One evening, several years ago now, Cindy and I are winding down for the evening, and I get a text message from our son, and he's asking, how do I get people to do what I tell them to do? Now, for background, he was working second shift in a manufacturing facility at the time. It was his very first evening in a backup lead position for the assembly line that he'd been part of for a couple of years at that point. And my answer to him was, call me tomorrow morning, because that's not something I can answer in a text. Now, when he did call me the next morning, the first thing I needed to know, if I was going to have any hope of providing him with some solid feedback, was why he was asking. Did the team members that he was referring to, were they not doing what they were required to do? Or did he believe they were capable of accomplishing more? Now, he was quick to say, hey, my team's great. They're already the most productive on the shift. But he felt like they could do even better, and he wondered how he could bring that out in them. Now, as a dad, I'm going to tell you, I still get excited all these years later when I think back about that conversation. The fact that Matt, in his early 20s at the time, saw more potential in his team, and he wanted to learn how he could bring it out in them, was something that I've just not seen very often, especially not in somebody in their early 20s. But to get the results that he was hoping for from having them do what he told them to, it wouldn't be as simple as making a blanket statement to all of them at the beginning of the shift. And only a few of them would have responded positively to him if he would have communicated with them the way he wanted to be communicated with. Now, like me, Matt's pretty direct, he's pretty to the point, and he really thrives on being challenged. And I'll tell you, that young man at 28 years old today, he'll go out of his way to accomplish a task, especially if somebody doesn't think he can. He just takes some pride in proving people wrong that doesn't believe in him. And that's kind of cool. I like that quality in him. Now, Matt certainly could have taken that approach of talking with them, telling them what he needed, but I'm positive that wouldn't have gotten the results that or anything close to what he was hoping for. Instead, what he and I ended up doing was we talked through how he could break the golden rule with each member of his team and do unto them as they wanted rather than how he would want. Now, because I knew each of the folks that he was working with, I was able to give him some fairly specific insight that helped him achieve that goal in his initial text message. But I was also able to provide him with a fairly simple approach for doing that same thing with anyone else moving forward. He was excited about how he would have that opportunity to put in practice. It was just really a matter of understanding how, and he had never had that before right then. So fast forward a little bit, a couple of weeks later, Matt calls me back after the conversation, and he says, "Oh my goodness, what kind of voodoo did you just teach me in this conversation?" And he was referring to how he had done this and he'd done that, and I assured him, "Hey, there's no voodoo, there's no black magic." But what he saw in just a few short weeks was that it already made an immediate increase in their daily productivity. And at least with the regards to their specific part of the organization, it was making a significant dent in that communication profitability killer. And what he was able to see was it was as simple as learning to act on what his team was showing him through their behavior. So that's a pretty cool thing I need you to really catch. He could see it through their behavior, and he could take action based on what they needed through what he saw in their behavior. So that might not sound so simple. Terms like human behavior and emotional intelligence, they often get quite a bit of attention in scientific and academic communities. So it would be easy for us to believe that learning to recognize what any given person needs by studying their behavior is something extremely complicated and might take years of study and observation. Like so many other things in academia, though, I think this has been made a whole lot more difficult than it really needs to be. Now, in chapter 7, I think it is, of Everyone Communicates, Few Connect, that I referenced earlier by John Maxwell, it's called Communicators Do Difficult Work by Keeping It Simple. John cites a fellow named John Beckley, who at one point in time was the editor of Newsweek, as saying the emphasis in education is rarely placed on communicating ideas simply and clearly. Instead, we're encouraged to use more complicated words and sentence structures to show off our learning and literacy. Instead of teaching us how to communicate as clearly as possible, our schooling in English teaches us how to fog things up. It even implants a fear that if we don't make our writing complicated enough, we'll be considered uneducated. Now, just as a quick side note, I'll share that just a week or so ago, I had a conversation with somebody saying, "Hey, when you wrote that email, I could almost hear you reading it." I've never really gotten caught up too much in that grammar, and I'm sure you've picked up on that. But I also haven't cared because I'm more interested in can somebody understand it and take action based on what the message I'm sharing. Now, here's the thing. I'm convinced that Beckley's statement is a big reason that organizations lose so much profitability to misunderstandings, because we've been taught if we're going to be perceived as intelligent, we got to complicate things. I'm also convinced that the same thing applies when it comes to the true simplicity of observing human behavior. Now, I don't make that statement as some clinician who spent thousands of hours in a lab watching somebody through a one-way mirror with electrodes attached to them. I share it from the perspective of a press operator who learned the simplicity of watching for behavioral patterns, and shortly after that, within just a few years, found myself teaching my peers across North America how to do the same thing. Now, in 1998, at just 22 years old and only a couple of college credits to my name, I learned how simple it was that to follow this simple approach that had been proven to be effective worldwide for observing how somebody works within just 10 to 15 minutes and being able to, with a high degree of accuracy, identify the potential they had for experiencing some type of workplace injury. Now, since the framework of this behavior-based safety process tied in so well with John's suggestion of keeping the cookies on the lower shelf so they're easier to reach, it was something that made sense to me immediately. It was simple, it was duplicatable, it was something I could repeat over and over. And not only did it make sense, it was something that I could use in practice right away after I learned it. It didn't take hours of practice. It didn't take days. It didn't take weeks or months. I could do it right as soon as I got back out onto the shop floor. Now, I didn't necessarily realize it at the time, but the simplicity of that same framework was really in providing a foundation for understanding why we behave the way we do. Now, once I had that in my head, though, learning how to recognize behaviors through a set of patterns proved to be really simple. Now, when it comes to the things that have been made appear so complicated, like ascending to some mystical plane that's called emotional intelligence, or proven that soft skills like leadership and communication are indeed very tangible, recognizing what our team members need by watching their behaviors shouldn't be like the cookies that are on the top shelf and can't be reached. Gosh, we need to be able to do all of those things really simply. So the simple approach that I taught Matt in less than an hour on the phone, we weren't even face to face. It was based on a pattern that we can all follow in every situation where communication matters. So I want to wrap this look up with how we can follow this thing called the platinum rule and why it's so critical to all that we do in communication. So with just a basic understanding of why people do what they do, Matt was able to really break that golden rule with his team, and he was able to avoid a bunch of the costs of poor communication. When he followed that simple pattern, he was able to really start adding fuel to a different fire. Instead of the fire that was responsible for killing the profitability and the productivity of that assembly line, the fire he was adding fuel to was one that gave each team member what they needed, and it yielded a level of buy-in and commitment that really ended up producing great results. What was the simple pattern? I'm glad you asked. So the pattern that he began to follow after our conversation, it consisted of a minor twist on that golden rule that so many of us grew up hearing over and over. When it really came to the way we communicate with others, our results can be so much better when we treat them the way they want to be treated instead of how we want to be treated. Now, this idea of the platinum rule was something a friend of mine mapped out to me close to a decade ago. Now, not only has it helped me in every interaction that I've had since, it's proven to be a game changer for helping leaders minimize the profit they're losing in their organizations due to the misunderstandings that are happening so frequently. Now, just like learning to observe and address behaviors that contribute to workplace injuries had a significant impact on reducing injury rates and workers' compensation costs because it was based on an understanding pattern, eliminating or at least minimizing the communication and the message that we send our teams is truly as simple as providing the message the way each individual can best receive it. And while that might seem like a pretty steep hill to climb, it really boils down to looking for the answers to two simple questions and tailoring our message based on what we see. Now, before I give you those questions, I want you to picture someone whose pace in approaching a task is drastically different from yours. Maybe that's somebody that's all in all the time and they just overwhelm you. Or maybe it's somebody who's much slower to take action, but they're very intentional about each and everything they do. Now, whether we need to speed up to hang with them or we need to slow down to make sure we're providing them with the time they need to process the details, communicating with someone who has a different pace from us, it requires a bunch of energy. But when we invest that time necessary to match our pace to theirs, we're communicating with them in a way that they're much more likely to receive, and we're knocking a big dent in that poor communication profitability killer. So that's the first question you can ask, and you can really identify that through what you see. Are they faster paced than me, or are they slower paced than me? That's question number one. Now, adapting our pace to be in line is something that we can do. It's fairly quickly. We can see it really fast, almost immediately in that interaction. And I'm not about to suggest here that it's easy, but I'm going to say it's easy to see and it's practical. The second question that we need to ask, and we need to be able to answer to be effective, to be able to effectively follow the pattern and do that whole platinum rule thing, communicate with them the way they need, not just how we want, it takes a little bit more focus. We need to determine whether the individual that we're communicating with is more focused on the task at hand or the people involved with that task with them. Now, providing you with a complete framework for doing this quickly every single time is more involved than I can get into here. But it's something that Cindy and I have helped dozens of organizations and hundreds of individuals become really, really effective with. Now, that said, what I am going to share with you here is a cheat code, and we all like cheat codes, right? So since 2/3 of everybody that we're ever going to interact with in the world at large tend to focus more on the people that they're involved with than the task at hand, our best course of action is to begin by showing that we value the individual before we dig into what needs to be accomplished. The more task-focused folks, let's be honest, they might get a little bit impatient. They might tap their watch, they might tap their foot, whatever, wanting to get some things done. But that impatience is usually pretty visible, and it serves as a cue for us to move things along, right? When we work through that for each individual, as Matt and I did that for each individual on our team, it took about an hour. And honestly, me knowing each of them for years prior to that conversation, it played a big role in how much detail that I could offer him specifically. But once he understood that pattern, he's been able to apply it in almost every interaction he's had since, whether it was new folks starting on his line as he was still in that role, or today as he interacts with the customers in the service technician role he's in on a daily basis, or even when he's in the line at a grocery store making small talk with somebody, right? It's something that we can see. It's something we can apply when we learn the pattern. And this simple pattern certainly helps address that poor communication profitability killer, but it also plays a role in keeping every other profitability killer we'll look at moving forward from taking a bigger toll on our businesses.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. If you'd like to go deeper into anything we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial of our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. That full program, it includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you really capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization. And it includes 2 live lessons each month with Q&A, so we can help you identify the specific steps you want to take to lead your team more effectively.